I want to spend time talking today about the most important pieces and focusing on some of the provocative ideas and what I feel to be the real turning points that we see manifest with Augustine in terms of religious history, both broadly and in terms of Christianity, Western Christianity in particular. Because Augustine, in his notion of will, and then of course with original sin, which is related to that, really marks a very interesting and profound change in terms of Western civilization. So he also provides us with a lot of good things to think about. So a couple of things by way of introduction. Augustine is going to be more focused on the interior life and on the manifestation of knowing the Trinity by way of knowledge, by way of self-knowledge, than what we see prior to him. And so what we see, for instance, in De Trinitate, on the Trinity, Augustine speaks of coming to know God, coming to know the divine, by way of coming to know oneself. And one of the characteristic difficulties in Christianity is if you have a notion of the divine that is beyond, that is all-encompassing, but yet not profane, not in the profane world in the same way. So in other words, unlike what we saw in the polytheistic systems, and unlike what we saw in what they're going to call pagan systems of Greek and Roman religion, where the divine was infused in everything, and everything was full of gods, and was divine in a certain measure. The Christian world is going to move away from that somewhat. And so the question of how one comes to know God, if one doesn't simply look out and see God everywhere, which is a possibility for Christianity and something that is explored as we move forward in time. But if you can't do that in the same way that the ancient Greek and Roman people could, then how do you come to know God? So Augustine says, well, if we are in the image of God, if we are made in the image of God, then naturally we have access to that image, even if we don't have a direct access to God. And so the best way of us learning what God is like is to look at his image, that is, ourselves. And so by looking inward and trying to come to know ourselves, not as individuals, but ourselves as human, ourselves as image. So as an image of God, if we can come to know what that means, then almost by proxy, we can come to know the divine. And so this creates a more inward-turning, inward-facing attitude toward religious knowledge and religious, really, questing. So his notion of progress, his notion of religious progress is going to be wrapped up with self-knowledge. And so it creates an almost philosophical approach, and one that is certainly not difficult to discern in terms of its lineage from philosophy. And so Augustine himself is very closely placed with respect to Greek and Roman philosophy. Now, he was a professor of rhetoric, and this is the profession that he describes trying to get away from. And in particular, in Book 9, he talks about finally getting away from that entirely because of various corruptive influences and whatnot. But as a professor of rhetoric, he would have been someone who would have been deeply involved not only in philosophy, but in rhetorical concerns, in concerns of persuasion and speech and, well, sophistry in some cases, right? So if you recall with Plato and Socrates, one of the primary complaints that Plato had against the sophists, rhetoricians of his age, which by the way is, I mean, we're talking 700 or 800 years before, this is a long time. I mean, there's a big gap between Plato and Augustine. His chief complaint was that they were not interested in the truth, and that what they were trying to do was merely persuade people and to bend people in various ways for more or less, personal gain and these sorts of things, political gain. And Augustine, of course, is going to be familiar with this, and the people that he is going to be instructing as a professor of rhetoric are largely going to be the sons of powerful people. So politicians who wanted their sons to become politicians and influential people in one way or another, one of the best ways of doing this was for them to learn oratory, for them to learn rhetoric, to learn how to persuade people and deal with ideas and argumentation. And I mean, it's effectively a targeted study of philosophy. But of course, Augustine is going to come to see this as more of a, well, perhaps we can say this without overstating it, more of a skill in something that has less heart in it, something that has not enough in terms of its connection to real human needs, spiritual needs, if you will. And so there's an increasing gap between that, what is taught as rhetoric at his time, and the spiritual needs of people. And this is something that arguably in Plato's time we don't see as much, at least with Socratic philosophy. With the sophists and whatnot, perhaps we're already seeing an interest in some of that kind of thing, because the skill in oratory is just so profoundly useful in terms of the political life. It was hard for it not to separate from the truth, to separate from spiritual needs from the divine in some way, because persuasion was itself something of a skill that could be developed. But nevertheless, so Augustine wants to get away from this. And at the same time, his connection to Greek and Roman philosophy is strong. And in particular, the connection to Neoplatonic philosophy is strong. And Augustine marks more or less the beginning of what we're going to see with a lot of Neoplatonic influence in Christian thought. And so by way of Origen, Evagrius, and many, many others, picking up influence from perhaps both the East and the West, in the form of Neoplatonism, we see some really substantial and interesting changes to early Christianity. So with Neoplatonism, what we get effectively is an emphasis on the oneness of the divine. And so at once, I think, when we hear this idea, it's important for us to connect it with monotheism, because effectively what we have is, with Plato, you have the world of the forms, and then you have the world of the profane manifestations, the ephemeral, contingent manifestations of living and dying and becoming. The world of the forms is eternal and unchanging, but there are presumably many forms. But all of the forms are unified by the highest form, which is the good. Now, Plato did not emphasize the good as the one in the same way that a lot of his followers would, and in the coming centuries, by the time we get to Neoplatonism, in terms of, let's say, 200 to 300 AD, again, many, many years after Plato, I mean 500 or 600 years after Plato at least, we really see something that is still Platonic, certainly recognizably Platonic. They thought of themselves as being Platonic, not Neoplatonic. They wouldn't have used that term. But at the same time, there is certainly a difference to be noticed, at least in emphasis. So with Neoplatonism, we have the emphasis on the one, and the progressive stages in falling away from the one or emanating from the one include the mind and then eventually to the world itself. And so there is a very internal approach to the whole thing, where one goes inward in terms of self-exploration and self-knowledge to get back to accomplish the return to the one. And so you have an emanation from the one into mind and world, and then you have a return to the one by way of the mind. And the mind sits more or less for the Neoplatonists on the threshold of the sacred and the profane, of the ephemeral and the eternal, of the worldly and the divine. And so for Christianity, this bridge, this threshold, is understood as a meeting point in terms of the symbolism associated with and the idea of Christ and the incarnation, because Christ is both man and divine. And so where we have the notion of God as divine, the notion of an individual as individual but image, we'll get to that in a minute, and the idea of Christ as bridging the two, and then the vehicle of which perhaps being the Holy Spirit. understood as love and wisdom. We have the two worlds of the divine and the human, the contingent, the profane, and Christ participating in both of those worlds. For the Neoplatonists, the mind was at the threshold, but as one returned to the one, so as the individual accomplished the return to the one, the mind itself was transcended. And so the individuality of a particular person, and indeed of the possibility of person, is transcended and given up, annihilated in that return to the one. So you begin on the contingent side with the individual life, and as the individual learns more about what sensual experience is, what it means to perceive and understand things, you learn more about yourself, you learn more about your own psychology, your own existence, and really what we want to say here is your own essence. In other words, what is it that makes you human? What is it about you that makes you human? And as you learn more about what that is, then you affect the return to a previous state. In other words, to more mind, and then ultimately to the one. And so, by way of self-knowledge, one moves back from the contingent to the divine. And in the process of which one loses one's individuality. And that's important because in the Christian context, you don't see quite the same sort of thing. And this is where some of the tension is created. Because for the Platonists, and for, recall, people in polytheistic societies, if you are possessed by a god, there is a strong sense in which your actions are not your own, and your own being, perhaps in many ways, is not your own. So insofar as you manifest particular archetypes, those archetypes are what is most real. And when I say most real, I do mean this in terms of a sliding scale of what's more real and less real. This is something that Plato makes explicit in Book 6 of the Republic. And with the imagery of the divided line, so the metaphor of the divided line. You can look that up and quickly find what I'm talking about there. Where you have the more real, the one, the good, the one, and then the realm of the forms, and then down to individual manifestations, and then to copies of things. So from more real to less real for Plato, which is that ultimately is the source of his attack on art and poetry in the Republic. It's a very famous argument. Anyway, so there's a strong sense in which if you're participating in the forms, you are not individual in that way. So insofar as you manifest and participate in the archetypes are the archetypes. They are not the individual. And so there is still this emphasis on the eternal and a de-emphasis of the individual. In Christianity, the individual persists in a stronger way. And this is something that it certainly shares and perhaps inherits from, one could argue one way or the other, from Stoicism. Stoicism grew up alongside Christianity in the same cultural complex of the Roman world. So what you have there is a more interior focus, a psychological focus, where one is concerned with getting inside and understanding oneself for the purpose of self-mastery, becoming self-sufficient, and living well, ultimately. Living well. So the old Greek idea, where if one gains knowledge, then that knowledge is therapeutic, therapeia, so it has therapy, it has a medicinal, a salutary quality to it. And this is something that's very different than the way that we approach knowledge today, which is the reason that I'm emphasizing it. So insofar as we learn more about things, we learn more about the essence of things, we learn more about ourselves thereby, then we come to greater health, we come to a better living. So spiritual fulfillment necessarily implies self-knowledge, which necessarily implies living well. And so this was a very Stoic sort of approach. And with the Stoics, what was unique and different in their approach was that you see an increased emphasis on the individual as individual. So in other words, when one participates in the forms, when one is a manifestation of the forms, thinks in terms of things, has emotions in one way or another, one is not simply ceding to Ares or Aphrodite or whatnot, but one still maintains an individuality throughout that in a stronger sense than we would have seen in previous centuries. And so by the time we get to Christianity, there's already been a lot of groundwork laid for the notion of the will, ultimately. And this is what's crucial in Augustine, and this is what is most important, and it's very hard for us to see it in retrospect, because we just assume that this is the way that people are, that you have an individual will, that individual will is involved in making choices, presumably all the important choices about belief and faith and religion, and that is just kind of the way that we're accustomed to thinking about Christianity. But this is not the way that religion was before this time. And this is still very much a new thing. And so Augustine is innovating in a strong sense with respect to the will in the passages, in the sections that you're reading. And this happens insofar as he locates responsibility and locates individuality persisting through this time in the will. And so in a way that was not possible in centuries previous to Augustine, we see a much more modern conception of the individual emerging during this time, and that modern conception of the individual is specifically tied to the evolution of the concept of the will. And so this is something that I want you to keep in mind as we move forward, because these are going to be some of the most important elements and things that are very easily missed. Now, in addition to the more interior focus on self-knowledge, it's also worth mentioning that Augustine's one of his other major innovations was the idea of original sin. And this is something that as well, we see the maintenance of the individual. So the individual persists throughout this notion. In other words, the conception of and the story of original sin is one where we have the individual and individual responsibility as a thread running throughout the story in a way that was simply not the case for previous conceptions of the individual. In polytheistic times, let's say, so for an ancient Greek or Roman centuries before, we would not have seen the individual and the notion of the individual, certainly not as immortal in the same way, as stretching throughout, as continuous throughout, and as responsible for all the various experiences and manifestations of things that we are accustomed to associating with consciousness and identifying with the individual at all times. This was certainly not the case there, but it's going to be increasingly the case. Now, is it entirely the case with Augustine? No, and it's not in important ways. And in Christianity in general, we still have the idea of grace throughout that forms something of a problem in terms of how do we understand the individual as individual, but at the same time as possessed by the divine in this way, as informed by the Holy Spirit, as being given grace. In other words, you have divine working, but still an individual. So is it still an individual who is being possessed, who is given grace, or, what is grace in that way? It really becomes a question and creates tension that was not there in previous centuries because there was not this problem of the individual persisting always and everywhere in terms of consciousness, in terms of experience. And so one could then think of the individual as being particular to a class of things that we experience, that we have as part of the world, as part of our consciousness, and not the entirety of it, not persisting throughout and not 100% responsible for all of it. And insofar as that becomes increasingly the case, we start to see some tension and we start to see a problem where it's not clear what the relationship of the individual to the divine should be and how it is that the individual should understand the process of transformation, conversion, religious change, and ultimately the process of coming to knowledge of God. And remember, again, this knowledge is salutary. This knowledge is related not only to living well, but of course in a Christian context, the knowledge of God is related to salvation. And so salvation being the rough equivalent of that knowledge of the good for Plato. So I want to begin the discussion of some of the particulars of Augustine by giving you a remark made by Festugière, who is a scholar in the early portion of the 20th century. And he said that when the church fathers, including Augustine, he's one of the major patristic figures, the major church fathers, he said, when the church fathers philosophize, they Platonize. And this was to emphasize, and this is why I'm mentioning this now, to emphasize the extent to which Platonism had an effect on Augustine and the early Christian thinkers. Let's take a look at some of the specifics on Augustine. So, the Confessions is a tremendously famous and influential book, and it's also very unusual in terms of literary history because it is a personal confession, and it is a narrative of Augustine's personal life from the perspective of him as an individual. And the individual was not emphasized as much, and we don't have autobiographies in the same way prior to this time. And there's some thought that maybe this is, if not the first, then one of the very earliest autobiographies. And so what we have is a very strange literary form in contrast to what we had seen prior to this. And so one has to question then, why is this necessary? Why is the approach that Augustine takes in the Confessions, why was that something that occurred to him? Why was it something that made sense? And does it work for the message that he's trying to convey? And so ultimately then we have to ask, what is the purpose of his writing in this particular way? And I think the answer lies somewhere in the changing notion of the self and the way that the individuals thought of themselves as individuals increasingly in terms of religion. And so religion became more of an individual thing, less of a communal thing, less of a ritualized thing, and more of an individual spiritual quest. And so when people thought of themselves as religious, this is a motion that we should detect and notice. And this is not going to reach a height really until the Middle Ages, and late Middle Ages in particular, where we see the ground laid for the early Renaissance, but it's still in this same mode of the changing notions of the individual. And so we're going to see changes in literature again. And so when we see new literary forms, this is one of the questions that we should ask. Why are they necessary? Why is it that all of a sudden we're seeing a change to literature? Why are people writing differently? Why are they expressing themselves differently? Oftentimes there are some deep-seated cultural reasons that can be unearthed and we can explore and profitably by asking these questions. So with Augustine, we have a chronicle of his conversion experience, especially here in Book 8. And this is the kind of the peak for the book. So you have the building up to this in the early portion of the book, the conversion experience here, which is absolutely crucial, and then a lot of other exploratory thoughts and whatnot after that for the remainder of the text. But the conversion experience is particularly important because, especially for our purposes in terms of trying to understand religious history, it is very different than what comes before, and it sets us up for understanding some of the changes that are going to happen afterwards. And so with Augustine, we have this grueling, just very vivid depiction of what it's like for him to undergo conversion, what it's like for him to try and create religious change, or try and create psychological change, however you want to characterize it, within himself. And so he is struggling against lust primarily, but desire generally. And he's struggling against his own will. And this is what's peculiar, and this is the way that it's framed. And he asks the question, why is it that I can want to make this change, but yet I am not strong enough to make this change? Somehow I can't actually make the change that I want desperately to be able to make. And this is a question of how much power does the will have in terms of transforming itself, in terms of transforming the mind? Because this is understood in terms of will. We are understood as having a will to sin, a will away from what it is that is good. And so you curry this knowledge and try and understand yourself as image of God, understand the divine, and create this transformation in yourself, which is understood to be a contest of will. And so we have this tension between what one believes to be, what one thinks one knows to be best, and what one is drawn toward, the desires that arise. And so this is a tension that we still have today in terms of trying to understand how we use the concept of will and what the individual is. Because when we think about what it is that I want as an individual, I might think, okay, well, I walk into a sandwich shop, I have a variety of choices, and so I can consciously will to make a particular choice, and that choice is understood to be mine in a strong sense, and that I am making that choice apparently freely. But the fact that I don't like mushrooms, the fact that I have a taste for a particular, German mustards, let's say, which all these things happen to be true, these are not things that I decided. These are not things that I have any control over. And if I happen to have a taste for pizza one day, that's not something that I can control. And so, is it mine? Is it something that we should attribute to the will? Should I say that that is mine in the same way that my own thoughts are with respect to choosing, among options that I believe myself to have? This is one of the really difficult portions of talking about free will today, and I think it's one of the really problematic things that we see in a lot of the free will discussions that we have now, because the assumption is that free will is something that should be entirely free, that I should have this kind of almost Sartrean, complete freedom with respect to choice, and that I'm not encumbered necessarily by any kind of desire, any kind of predisposition at all, and that I am entirely free at every moment. But at the same time, it's almost as though, even with prosaic examples like, I smell pizza and I want pizza, we know better. We know that we're not entirely free with respect to our desires. I can't control what kind of music I like. I can't control what kind of art I find beautiful, what kind of people I find to be attractive. These are things that I don't control. I don't have conscious control over in the same way that I do with, choosing ham versus turkey for a sandwich for lunch. And so for the medievals, this wouldn't have been a problem. For Augustine, this is not a problem, because these things are all understood in terms of will. They are still understood as being free, even though we are not on a momentary basis free. But oftentimes, a lot of the studies that are done now, especially in terms of experimental psychology and people who get excited about brain science and trying to put to rest any notion of free will, when they're talking about free will, they're frequently talking about this just absolutely free choice that we believe we have on a momentary basis when I'm choosing, sausage versus pepperoni pizza. This is really not the way that free will has been talked about historically, and is a more modern conception, really more of an Enlightenment era conception, I would argue. This is when we really start to see this sort of thing. And the idea of the tabula rasa, the blank slate. When we start getting these philosophies of freedom, especially tying back, seems like all roads lead back to Kant, Immanuel Kant with this. But if we go back further and we go into the medieval period and then into Augustine, who is more or less the originator of the earliest transformations in terms of the Western conception of the will and the self, we really just don't see that kind of concern with free will conceived of like that. So anyway, when Augustine is talking about freedom of will, he is more or less talking about aligning one's will with God. And so the tradition that is going to follow from Augustine in theology and Christianity, and especially in Western Christianity, we see the Augustinian tradition is one that emphasizes a transformation of will. And that transformation of will is from the desires and the predispositions, the dispositions that are associated with individual desires, in other words, with selfish desires. And so we have that in the beginning, and we transform that and move it towards an aligning with God's will. And that aligning with God's will then is free will. And so one's will is completely free when the self-will has been entirely mortified, has been entirely annihilated. This is the Augustinian conception of the movement from the worldly concerns to the annihilation of the selfish will, not just identification with, but the assimilation with the divine will. And so this is, I think, a very different conception of freedom than what we are accustomed to. But it is one that resolves a lot of tensions, certainly. It resolves a lot of problems for Christian theology in terms of, for instance, do people have free will in heaven? Can you sin in heaven? And for Augustine, this is really just not an interesting question. Of course you can't. When one's will is entirely identified with, assimilated into God's will, then there is no sin. And when one wills what God wills, then one is naturally pure and good and healthy in this way. And so this is more or less the transformation that we're talking about with Augustine. And the conversion experience is a conversion of will, and the conversion is from the selfish will. Specifically, he focuses on lust, and this is part of a tradition of a few authors that really start to bend Christianity toward a concern with sex in particular, and lust more broadly, lust understood as desire. But this is the last hurdle, more or less, for Augustine. And as he gets over that and is able to truly turn his back on that, this is when we see the kind of graphic conversion experience that he has in the garden, such that his will becomes God's will, and he becomes someone really very different. And so this is, as I said, we should really be thinking as you're reading through this, and it's worth reading a second time, just looking for these details of how it is that he describes the person, how it is that he describes the individual will as changing and as capable of change throughout Book 8 and throughout the conversion experience, because this is going to set kind of a mold, a type for Christianity, Christian conversion, and saintliness for years to come. And so while we're going to see later a contest between intellect and will in terms of, what is the best path to the divine, effectively, Augustine is going to land largely in terms of, although you have an intellectual study, an intellectual component, the force of transformation and conversion is going to be understood in terms of will. So that's a lot of what I wanted to highlight with the reading on Augustine. It's something that I want us to be thinking about, because these same kinds of issues are going to manifest in different ways as we move forward in time. But I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the changes that we see with Augustine are in many ways stronger than the changes that we're going to see even almost up to 1,000 years later. And so Christianity really, in absorbing Neoplatonic ideas and differentiating itself from Greek and Roman pagan religion, polytheism, that change between the Greek and Roman polytheism of Plato, the archetypal and traditional focus with respect to time and the eternal, that change from that to Christianity and the emergence of the modern individual, the conception of the will, and the way in which individual transformation is understood in terms of the religion and getting along in society broadly, that's a bigger change right there than what we're going to see almost for a millennium afterwards. So hopefully this helps a little bit in contextualizing Augustine. It's very easy for his work to seem a little too familiar to us in terms of the way that he describes the transformation experience. Again, his notion of the will, and particularly free will, might be a little bit foreign to the way that we're accustomed to talking about it, but the fact that he's talking about a will at all might seem fairly natural to us, which is really pretty amazing, considering this is, 1,600 plus years ago, and just how different it was even just in a few centuries before that. So Augustine really is, in many ways, and can be argued to be, the first modern for these reasons. And so this is a real break between classical antiquity and the emergence of the earliest forms of the modern world.